Hey Dragon Slayers! Today's video is about fat cell size and its connection to insulin resistance, part 1. Fat cell size matters. Did you know that your fat cells may only be able to hold a limited amount of fat? Like an overflowing cup, when your fat cells are full, the excessive fat begins spilling over into the blood and potentially getting stored in other tissues. The precise process is being actively studied, but the most consistent results suggest that it's because the fat cells are simply becoming insulin resistant. Insulin sends a powerful signal to the fat cell to store fat, which means to both pull fat in directly from the blood and to make new fat from glucose. However, insulin also slams the exit doors closed to prevent any fat from leaving, inhibiting the fat shrinking process known as lipolysis. There is a fascinating and even obvious difference between fat cells that are in insulin sensitive mode and continuing to store fat, and those that are insulin resistant and leaking fat. It's all about their size. As we gain fat, our fat tissues can grow in two ways. They either increase in the number of fat cells, and yet the fat cells themselves remain relatively small. This is called hyperplasia. Or they grow in cell size, and the number of fat cells remains low, but the fat cells themselves get larger, and this is known as hypertrophy. Larger fat cells have relatively fewer insulin receptors for their size than smaller fat cells. Because of this, larger fat cells may not receive sufficient insulin stimulus. As a result, the larger fat cells experience a degree of fat breakdown despite the presence of insulin attempting to block this process. This series of events is evidence of a personal fat threshold, a limit to the size of the fat cells and fat mass by extension. When a fat cell reaches its maximum dimensions through hypertrophy, which is several times that of a normal fat cell, it attempts to limit further growth. An excellent way to do this is to become insulin resistant to insulin's growth signaling. However, if fat cells can multiply via hyperplasia, they never reach this limit and maintain sensitivity. An interesting scenario plays out when we explore this idea in more detail. Let's imagine two people, one with fat cell hypertrophy and the other with fat cell hyperplasia. The first fellow, whose fat is growing via hypertrophy, will stop gaining weight as the enlarged fat cells become insulin resistant and refuse to grow any further. This person could be only moderately overweight by conventional standards, yet be very insulin resistant. That describes me perfectly. In contrast, the second fellow, whose fat cells are multiplying, will continue to gain weight and have a greater potential to be very overweight, yet likely maintain a high degree of insulin sensitivity. We can actually hijack this process with modern science. In a fascinating example of the power of fat cell size in determining insulin sensitivity and metabolic health, insulin resistant patients are sometimes prescribed a type of medication known as a thiazolidinediones. I might have butchered that, but I tried. That actually forces the fat cells towards hyperplasia. Following this, an interesting scenario ensues. Patients start gaining weight but become more insulin sensitive. The drugs help fat cells continue to proliferate and store fat, which helps with controlling insulin. But unfortunately, it hurts weight control. Importantly, the insulin resistant fat cells grows beyond its borders, not only leaks fat, but because it's too big, it becomes inflamed, dumping inflammatory proteins into the blood. In the end, this means that the body is receiving a toxic mix of too much fat and too much inflammation, both of which drive insulin resistance. You might be able to determine your own fat tissue's insulin resistance with numbers from a blood test. If you can, next time you have your blood test, ask your healthcare provider to measure your insulin levels in microunits per millimeter and your free fatty acids in millimoles per liter. With these two numbers, you have what you need. Normally, insulin prevents fat cells from shedding their fat, which comes in the form of free fatty acids. Of course, if the fat cells are becoming insulin resistant, insulin may be high. And because it's not working all too well, free fatty acids would also be high. A recent publication found that a fat formula score of 9.3 is insulin times free fatty acids was the optimal cutoff. If your score is lower than 9.3, you can take some comfort that your fat cells are still responding to insulin appropriately. That's what I've got for you guys today. Don't forget to like and subscribe because it really helps the channel out. And remember, guys, that together, you and I will slay the dreaded diabetes dragon.